Hidden within the margins of century-old military maps are inked anomalies, forgotten islands, impossible roads, nameless symbols, each a corridor into a quieter, stranger history that refuses tidy explanation. A single pencil mark at the edge of a tactical chart will lead you into a different kind of battlefield, one of silence and questions. These are not the maps tourists buy. They are ledger sheets of strategy, accidents, and secrets, and they sometimes hold things the mapmakers never intended to explain. For every fortress that appears on a plan, there are shadows in the margins, smudged notes, erased villages, coordinates that point to nothing and everything. The map unfolds like a face. Folds are creases of memory, ink the wrinkles of decisions made under measured fear. In the oldest military survey I first encountered, a thin line skirts a marsh and ends, not at a road or river, but at a small oval shaded darker than anything nearby. The cartographer has labeled nothing. From a distance it could be a pond. Close up, the shading looks deliberately different, as if the drafter wanted the reader to notice but not to know why. This is the first of 10 such discoveries we will follow, anomalies that feel like purposeful edits to a record. They are discoveries because they exist where no one expected them. They are unexplained because the official logs that should have explained them have been lost, redacted, or never kept. Listen for a pattern I will return to. Many of these marks sit at the intersection of authority and forgetting, places where official attention once settled and then receded. Keep that promise in your mind. What were they trying to hide, or simply forget? A clay road that led nowhere. The 19th century map of a training range shows a service route branching off from the main road and running straight for 2 miles into scrub. On modern satellite imagery, the land reads as scrub and pasture. No trace of a road remains. Local oral history remembers a line of wooden posts that children once played around until the posts rotted. Contemporary explanations suggest a seasonal training lane, a temporary track laid for maneuvers and removed when no longer needed. Engineers point to the practice of constructing ephemeral roads for armored movement during exercises, purpose-built, then reclaimed by the earth. Speculative. What if this lane led to a buried testing site, a shallow pit repurposed for anything from ordnance testing to something quieter and private? Along the edge of the area, an old farmer's granddaughter keeps a rusted tin tag with an embossed number she says was given to workers who came in the night. The tag is almost certainly a supply label. It is also almost certainly more than that. Why would a temporary lane be documented with the permanence of paper if it was meant to be ephemeral? In a coastal quadrant, an island stands on maps dated to the early 20th century, then vanishes in later editions. The charting shows contour, a small cluster of rocks, and curiously a tiny square, a built structure, perhaps a shed. Coastal processes do move things. Storms reshape shorelines, sea levels change. The mainstream reading is simple: the island eroded away. Yet when divers sounded the site in the 1990s, their depth recordings hinted at a submerged flat top that could have supported human structures. Locals tell of fishermen who found odd concentrations of stone there in the spring of certain years, and of a lamp that once swung from a chain and then was no longer seen. Speculative. Could this have been an artificial platform built for a watch post, then scuttled and left to sink? Or was it an intentionally recorded phantom island, a cartographic decoy meant to mislead enemy navigation? A retired chart clerk who once inked nautical signs on official charts remembered being instructed to mark features of interest without providing further annotation. He kept his copy. He says only, "It had a square on it." That was enough. Would a mapmaker knowingly draw a false island, and for whom would that falsehood have been made? On a topographic sheet of a plateau, a ring of small symbols sits where no village is known to have existed. The symbols resemble little graves, a row of crosses that someone has taken the trouble to align in a near-perfect circle. The archival catalog lists the map as surveyed during an era of military road building. The surveyor's field notes carry no mention of grave markers. Archaeologists who later walked the plateau found flattened earth and the occasional scrap of ceramic suggesting transient occupation, but no burial. Mainstream explanations range from misinterpreted stone cairns used as survey markers to ritual features predating the mapmakers. Speculative. Could these have been place markers for munitions caches, discrete signs that meant something to those who hid stores and needed to retrieve them quickly? An old teacher, now retired, remembers a children's rhyme about the ring that eats the rain, sung when her village children dared each other to pass by the plateau at dusk. Rhyme, one remembers, preserves things official records forget. Are symbols that resemble graves warnings, memorials, or something else entirely? Hidden in the margin of an operational atlas, a small notation reads as a series of coordinates separated by commas. Their formatting differs from the rest of the sheet. When plotted on contemporary maps, the points land on barren moor and one on a river bend now beneath a reservoir. Military clerks propose an administrative answer. The coordinates were points of geological surveying, used to check triangulation baselines. Civil engineers counter that their distribution is oddly clustered for purely geodetic work. Speculative. The points mark caches, not measurements, caches of supplies, of records, or of objects that someone wanted to hide from the public eye. In a village near the moor, an elderly man produced an old tin box with a lock shaped like a horseshoe. He found it while fox hunting in the 1950s and kept it ever since. The horseshoe lock is a minor, evocative human detail, a small remnant that hints at private efforts to secure something in the open landscape. Did coordinates on a clean ledger trace a path to what someone refused to document in words? A line of erased text runs along a training map as if the pen paused and then retreated. Careful infrared scans of the original paper show that the erasure is not the work of a later hand. The drafter himself seems to have cross-hatched over the entry before the ink dried. The item erased corresponded, in earlier drafts, to a structure marked near a river. Archivists suggest clerical correction, an error struck through when someone noticed a misplacement. Military historians note an alternative, strategic secrecy. On several maps tied to the same campaign, marginal scratches are visible where notation was removed. Speculative. The erasure may hide the name of a clandestine testing program, a codeword which, if revealed, would identify operations still sensitive decades later. Alternately, it could conceal a human error that admitted a failure the institution preferred not to record. A retired map conservator who had handled the sheet for decades kept a scrap of the removed paper, folded small and pored over with a child's care. He said simply, "Some things they would rather not have been true." When an institution strikes from the record, what else does it strike from collective memory? A military hydrographic chart bears a curious symbol repeated at 3 separate points along a fjord, a small black dot surrounded by 3 short radiating lines. No legend on the map explains it. Later editions replaced the symbol with a faintly labeled D. The civilian port authority believes the mark denotes dangerous soundings or submerged obstructions. Veterans of navigation whisper a different theory. Signs used during wartime to indicate places where small landing craft could find shelter from aerial reconnaissance. Speculative. If those dots were signals to specialized boats, their repetition across the fjord suggests a network, a chain of places connected by purpose rather than geography. A lighthouse keeper's daughter kept a piece of a rope with burnt ends she said came from one of those places, and claimed her father once ferried men there on moonless nights. Rope like that tells function more than a map. It tells of the hands that did the work and the practicalities behind ink. Do repeated symbols on sterile charts betray a living, moving infrastructure beneath the paper? An inland engineering map shows a small rectangular enclosure on a hill, annotated in cramped script with a letter combination that corresponds to no known unit in the compiler's roster. The enclosure's drawn walls have a thickness suggesting concrete rather than simple earthworks. Field surveys decades later uncovered slab foundations exactly where the map suggested, with reinforced corners and rusted rebar protruding. The mainstream explanation points to a failed construction project, a storage bunker begun then abandoned. Speculative. The bunker was not storage but containment, built to hold material, living or otherwise, that was never meant to be catalogued. An old postmaster in a nearby hamlet remembers parcels arriving with no sender and departing with no signatures. The routine secrecy around them was shrugged off as wartime oddity. The physical remains, concrete poured and left to the elements, argue that something was intended to be kept in place long after the need for it would have passed. What did men build to hold that later generations would find indefinite and indecipherable? In one highland map, a narrow track climbs to a flat ridge and ends at a small circle marked with the word 13. Soldiers who trained in the region in the 1940s and 1950s recall grid marks, used to practice navigation under instrumentless conditions. Instructors would place numbered flags and call the students to find them by ear and by the feel of the land. Cartographic scholars suggest 13 is part of such training shorthand. But when a local shepherd followed the track decades later, he found beneath the turf a concrete disc the size of a table with metal fittings bored into its rim. Not a temporary flag base, but something meant to take weight and to remain. Speculative, perhaps the disc-supported apparatus, a radar reflector, a directional beacon, or a mooring for something now vanished. An aunt of the shepherd swore she once heard, on a night of storm, a deep metallic hum from the ridge that set their windows to rattling. The memory is as much a mood as a fact, but memories anchor otherwise abstract map marks in human experience. Was the numbered circle a school for navigators, a forgotten instrument post, or a marker of a technology that outlived those who used it? A disused railway spur traces across a valley and terminates at an abrupt embankment with no station. The line appears in an interwar map as an armament spur. The words are literal, attached in parentheses to a tiny warehouse symbol. The spur was dismantled and the rails removed. Satellite imagery shows a hairline scar where the embankment was. Survivors remember guarded convoys along that axis, allowed through checkpoints at night. The archival record is thin. Supply ledgers list freight without destination. Speculative. The spur serviced a temporary range for munitions trials, or it led to a covert logistics node serving agents and shipments never logged in public ledgers. A woman who had been a telegraph clerk as a young woman kept a bundle of dispatches with routing ticks and no signatures. She described their arrival as clean and cold, as if the paper itself bore the mood of the orders. When rail disappears but ledger entries remain, which is the more honest record, the road or the paper that pretended the road didn't matter? A set of maps from a single series shows a curious progression. On consecutive editions, features darken, then are relabeled with code words, then removed. The map series thus reads like an index of attention. Things that mattered once are first emphasized and then de-emphasized. Scholars point to practical reasons. Tactical priorities change. Conspiracy-minded readers see intent. In the afternoons of the map archive, handling yellowed sheets, a historian found a pencil line connecting two formerly separate notations. A line made not in ink but in graphite, later traced faintly by a damp smudge. The graphite line is an accidental human fingerprint amidst institutional erasures. Speculative. Do such progressions indicate a life cycle of secrecy, things born into necessity, later normalized into maps, then extinguished in erasures? A map clerk's granddaughter still recites the cadence her grandfather used when checking plates. Mark the known. Shadow the unknown. Hide the mistake. The cadence is human and bureaucratic both. Are the changes across editions clues to institutional memory, or to deliberate obfuscation? On a wartime coastal defense map, the surveyor drew small, precise rectangles along a bay and labeled them with numbers corresponding to ordnance calibers. Later editions changed the labels to letters, then removed them. Diver reports in the 1970s cataloged metallic fragments and concrete pads at the locations once annotated. The mainstream story: these were emplacement sites for coastal guns, removed in later demobilizations. Yet the letter coding in later charts matches no standard ordnance alphabet of the period. Speculative. Could coding have been adopted to disguise purpose from anyone who might intercept the map, or to reassign status should the maps fall into wrong hands? A retired diver, now stone-faced, kept a rusted tag from a shell casing he brought up, stamped faintly with the maker's code. It is a small bureaucratic relic that insists on material truth amid cartographic silence. When codes replace labels on a map, are they protecting or erasing history? A curious cartographic footnote: several maps from different surveyors, across decades and regions, show little circles with radiating ticks. The symbol recurs more often than chance would allow. The contexts vary: one marks a hilltop, another a river ford. The map's creators were not part of the same unit, yet the symbol persists. Map historians suggest it denotes a triangulation point or a survey beacon. Some pragmatists argue it was simply a favored shorthand adopted by draftsmen who had worked together earlier in their careers. Speculative. Might the symbol be an internal sign among technicians marking points of secret communication or caches? An old technician told a student once, half joking, "We left breadcrumbs in ink." The admission may be jocular or literal. It is at least an index of human practice. Maps bear the fingerprints of their makers in small, recurring marks. Do recurring ink signs in different hands point to shared practice or shared purpose? The sun had set on the ink long before anyone thought to ask why the ink had settled where it did. Later, we would find that many of these marks were less about the land than about the loyalties and anxieties of the hands that drew them. Pause. A mapmaker's small flourish can be a signature or a secret. In a lowland sheet, a slender dashed line threads across marsh and fen and stops abruptly at the edge of a copse marked R. The legend gives no account of R. Fieldwork decades later revealed a circle of planks hidden beneath the peat, their timbers waterlogged but still oriented as if they had once supported something rectangular and heavy. Local lore, the kind that arrives via fishermen at the inn, speaks of a room in the reed, where strangers exchanged packages by lantern. The practical explanation favored by surveyors is prosaic. The dashed line is a drainage cut, and R indicates a rebed, abbreviated in a shorthand that later editors misread. Speculative. The planks might have been the remains of a pontoon platform used for clandestine transfer, a built place intentionally ephemeral, and therefore uncommemorated in formal records. A woman who remembers rowing as a child told me of a night she stumbled on a lantern and, frightened, fled. That memory sits oddly vivid next to the quiet timber fragments. The map, quiet on its face, knew more than the ledger. When a reed is marked with an unspoken letter, what sort of commerce or covenant could have been practiced there? A fortress plan drawn in meticulous ink shows a square compound with an interior marked by a strange, nearly perfect spiral of stones. The stones are too uniform to be natural scatter and too small to be typical defensive works. Military engineers reading the plan suggested it was an error, a misinterpretation of contour shading. Later archaeologists excavating the site uncovered a ring of carefully laid cobbles containing ash and traces of heat-altered clay. Mainstream interpretation leans to ritual hearths, perhaps older than the fort itself, a reused sacred space that found new purpose beneath military occupation. Speculative. Could the spiral have been a field marker for nocturnal exercises, arranged to aid orientation under blackout conditions? Or was it a symbolic act left by troops to ward off fear? An ex-sentinel once showed a faded photograph in which his squad stood at the outer edge of the spiral, faces set and young. He could not explain why they posed there, only that they all agreed it felt like a place that held its own. Memory and stones sometimes keep the same secret. If soldiers stood in a spiral and could not say why, what was the spiral keeping quiet? A political map folded into an officer's kit displayed an odd annotation, a precise rectangle shaded and underlined, accompanied by the single letter G. The rectangle lay atop a low-lying vale. For decades the mark was dismissed as a surveyor's shorthand for groundworks. But a farmer whose family had worked the vale produced, from an attic, a photograph of men erecting what looked like metal frames there in the late 1930s. The frames were never explained. Engineers later found subsurface footings that match heavy installations rather than agricultural structures. The official tale offers utility: temporary anti-aircraft platforms, mounted and then removed. The speculative track asks if the vale might have hosted instruments intended not only for defense but for other experiments, a place where the line between military necessity and technological curiosity blurred. A surviving diary page, smudged and anonymous, references the experiment on the vale, and little else. That fragmentary page is the skeleton key that refuses to fit any lock we can find. When a rectangle is simply G on paper, what metaphors for secrecy does G hold? On a 20th century aerial reconnaissance overlay, a tiny, deliberate blot appears at the flank of a ridge, surrounded by crosshatched shading as if to emphasize its darkness. The annotator's hand has added a faint note. Do not disclose. It is the only map in the folder that bears any such injunction. Archivists suggest a clerical warning meant to protect a sensitive site. Veterans recall that certain map plates were kept in separate safes during campaigns. Anthropologists point to a psychological reading: we mark what scares us to keep our distance from it. When demolition teams visited the ridge after war's end, they found not a military installation but a shallow rectangular cut, lined with metal plates corroded beyond recognition, a small vault whose contents had been removed in haste. The civil explanation is functional: stores retrieved and the holding structure left. Speculative: perhaps the site briefly housed something that officials believed would not withstand public scrutiny, material whose existence raised ethical or political complications, and so the map's terse "do not disclose" is as much a command as a confession. A retired courier who transported sealed crates remembers being told only, "Deliver to the ridge. Ask no questions." Human obedience can be an instrument of secrecy. The maps are its score. What does an instruction to "do not disclose" on a sheet of paper ask of the men who obeyed it? An inland plateau map contains a notation of a phantom canal, a canal surveyed on paper that was never dug. The surveyed line connects two streams but was abandoned after the first stone was turned. Agricultural reports explain it away as an aborted irrigation scheme. But interviews with older inhabitants recall barges pulled by men at dawn, bringing sacks to an invisible wharf. Fabric remains, tarred rope, a rusted pulley, were found in the sod where the canal should have been. Speculative: was the surveyed but unbuilt canal a deliberate decoy, a project on paper intended to suggest infrastructure and mislead would-be enemies or investors? Alternatively, could it have been a plan halted by a top-secret pivot in military priorities? A public works scheme suddenly repurposed for quieter ends? A ledger of expenditures lists sums for earthworks during the same months. The books do not reconcile with physical remains. Money can leave marks in paper as stubborn as traces in soil. Why chart a canal you had no intention of building? To fool whom, and for what gain? A slender coastal map shows a cluster of small islets annotated with a dashed perimeter and the phrase, "Exercise area, restricted." Fishermen still avoid those shoals at certain seasons, citing an old fear of snagging nets on something unseen. Studies of seabed topography show anomalous scatterings of metallic detritus consistent with range debris. The utilitarian reading, a gunnery range, is plausible. But fishermen report, across interviews, occasional finds of non-military objects, carved bone fragments, fragments of pottery, items that seem older than shells. Speculative: the area might overlay a sequence of human use extending back centuries, interrupted by modern militarization. An elderly mariner handed me a carved figurehead fragment he had found on a shoal and kept tucked in his oilskin. He could not say from what ship it came, only that it felt like a memory of someone else's voyage. Objects washed on a shore sometimes carry stories older than the maps that hide them. If a firing range overlays older wreckage, which history are we silencing with the phrase, "restricted"? A valley topographic shows an unusual network of short, regular trenches like teeth in the hillside. They are not long enough to be defensive lines and their spacing is tight. Agricultural surveys cite drainage works. Military manuals mention practice trenches for foxhole exercises. But veteran noncoms remember them as sound trenches, small cuts used in acoustic experiments to study how sound carried across valleys for early warning detection. Later scientific reviews found alterations in soil compaction patterns consistent with repeated heavy use in narrow bands. A woman whose father once served in a nearby battery told a story of being bidden to hush after sunset because they were listening. Speculative: perhaps the trenches were part of an effort at electronic eavesdropping or early detection, a non-lethal, information-focused frontier of warfare that would later explode into modern signals intelligence. The trenches are mute artifacts of an era when listening once meant digging. When trenches are built not to hide people but to hear, what were they listening for? An enigmatic symbol appearing on a transport atlas is a small, stylized triangle filled in with faint horizontal lines. It sits adjacent to a route that, in physical terms, leads nowhere now. The road has been cut by reservoir waters. Older maps show a little pier where the triangle sits. Modern divers found submerged pilings at depth where the pier would have been. The pier's pilings hold incrustations consistent with industrial loading rather than leisure. The shipping ledgers uncovered list consignments to Site T, with minimal annotation. Engineers proposed a temporary jetty for loading heavy equipment. The speculative voice asks if Site T might have been a cover identity for secret transfers that required plausible deniability. A former dockworker, now frail, slid a small brass tag across the table and said, "It had T stamped on it. They were always careful to say only the letter." A stamped letter on brass is as pure an administrative footprint as a soldier's boot print, indexical and mute at the same time. What does the letter T on a tag mean when it is the only word you are allowed to say? A Borderlands map housed in a regional archive contains, in the margin, a faintly penciled etching of a human silhouette beside a notation. No return. The paper is smudged, as if the drafter had cried or been hurried. The archive catalog file tied to the map has a note from a clerk saying the sheet came from an officer's estate with no further explanation. The practical account from historians suggests the phrase marks a dangerous crossing, a gorge where men often died. Oral narratives complicate the ledger. Families in the nearby hamlet describe a pattern of men who went to the line and were never spoken of again, their lives erased in polite conversation. Speculative was the no return, a euphemism for a site of enforced disappearance, a place where those in power sent people to vanish? A widow whose brother left for the line never found his grave. She keeps a small, folded shirt that once belonged to him. The shirt is a private archive that will not map comfortably onto official records. How does a cartographer's faint pencil become a family's last document? A late-war secrecy plate shows an isolated rectangle labeled with a string of numbers rather than text. The numbers are not grid references but appear to be an administrative code. When the sequence is cross-referenced with supply lists from nearby depots, a pattern emerges. Identical codes crop up in logistics for various regions, always associated with sealed consignments moved at night. Declassification later revealed that some of these numbers corresponded to technology transfers to Allied technicians. Other codes remain opaque. The mainstream summary is bureaucratic, coded shipment references. The speculative angle reads the pattern as an economy of secrecy, an accounting strategy to make certain things legible only to those with the key. A clerk in a retirement home runs his finger along his old ledger and mutters the cadence of code entries the way a musician might hum a tune. It is a human trace of an otherwise cold bureaucracy. When numbers stand where names should be, who holds the ledger key and what do they protect? A coastal survey once bore a penciled note in the margin. Bathymetry inconsistent with charted shoal. The hand was small and impatient, as though the observation had been a nuisance. The map itself showed a shallow bank extending from the shoreline like a finger, and yet multiple soundings taken by small craft recorded sudden depths that should not have existed there. Hydrographers later returned with echo sounders and recorded a jagged bed, a scatter of slabs and angular masses that looked as if they had been placed rather than formed. The mainstream reading accepted storm-driven collapse and shifting currents. Local boatmen offered a different memory, of a night in which their nets snagged on metal and they brought to surface a length of pipe stamped with foreign ordnance marks. Speculative possibilities range from the practical, a scuttled barge or discarded coastal defenses, to the a deliberately altered seabed, designed to mislead chart readers or to create an obstacle for certain classes of vessel while leaving others unharmed. An old fisherman kept, in a biscuit tin, a corroded tag with a manufacturer's cipher and the faint impression of a crest. It is the kind of object that insists in industrial provenance without telling the whole story. If the sea keeps mechanical things as if in a slow museum, whose past are we diving into when we pull up a stamped pipe? A range map drawn for ordnance testing is speckled with concentric rings, each annotated with the year of use and a shorthand for projectile type. Somewhere near the center of those rings the drafter has added a single, emphatic X and written, in tiny script, "Do not enter." Decades later, environmental surveys revealed pockets of contaminated soil where those rings converge, but the contamination did not match the listed munitions. Instead, the chemical signature hinted at industrial residues inconsistent with declared trials. Historians emphasized the chaos of wartime priorities and the poor record-keeping of hastily arranged experiments. Toxicologists hypothesized cross-contamination with industrial waste. Speculative. Could the X mark a different sort of test, perhaps of material that had to be hidden off official inventories, or an early field experiment in materials science that later became a sensitive technology? A woman who grew up near the range described being shooed indoors during certain scrub-burning exercises and recalling an acrid, metallic sweetness in the air afterward. Small human recollections like that give texture to the otherwise sterile circle denotations on a planner's sheet. When planners add a single X and a terse warning to a plate, what stories do the rings around it refuse to tell? On a map intended to guide engineers through upland fortifications, an inset shows a tidy rectangle printed with the phrase, "Vault sealed." The drafter has taken trouble to render the rectangle in heavier ink, to set it apart. Archive correspondence later revealed a short memo noting the transfer of material to a vault and its subsequent sealing. The memo stops there. Museums and official curators offered plausible explanations: artifacts, archives, or ordnance stored and locked away for protection. Speculative readings, pushed by local rumor, suggested the vault once received living specimens, animals used in early physiology studies, or worse, humans placed under experimental observation. When one elderly archivist allowed the author to photograph a bundle of wrapped labels recovered from the vault's dehumidified holdings, the labels listed items as dry, mechanical things. Lens, coil, film. The labels do not confirm sensationalized theories, but they do reveal a bureaucratic minimalism that can operate as a veil. Can the simple word "sealed" act as a social password that bars questions and erases the traces of ethical choice? A cartographic plate for a riverine corridor includes, oddly, a small grid of dots annotated test posts. When historians went to the positions, they found not posts but a landscape of scorched turf and burnt stone, the memory of heat but little durable evidence. Oral testimonies from children who grew up nearby tell of nights when the horizon glowed with unfamiliar light and of trains of dark vans moving undercover. Military engineers suggested the posts were instrumentation for blast measurement or pyrotechnic testing. Geologists proposed controlled burns and peat subsidence as explanations for the scorched impressions. Speculative, perhaps the posts were markers for controlled detonations of devices designed to modify terrain acoustics or to generate smoke screens for large troop movements. An old schoolmaster handed over a faded black and white picture showing men in protective clothing handling drums near a tent. He could not identify their purpose beyond some kind of testing. Photographs, like maps, often keep their mouths shut with dignified stiffness. If dots on a page correspond to places that glow at night, what did authorities think they were hiding by recording them so lightly? A military railway schematic bears a curious annotation at a junction, a faded stamp that reads simply, XFER classified. The stamp's placement suggests a transfer of responsibility rather than a physical feature, but subsequent research linked activity at the junction to a pattern of nightly freight movements conspicuously absent from public timetables. Archivists who manage freight manifests described a catalog of consignments routed via coded lines and then deleted in later transcriptions. A retired guard who patrolled the junction in the immediate post-war years remembered an instruction: do your duty, keep your eyes down, and do not engage travelers who do not speak. Mainline explanations point to logistic mismanagement and the messy nature of demobilization. The speculative interpretation reads the stamp as a bureaucratic scale of secrecy, the paper analog of a locked gate, classification that converts reality into a function of omission. A small brass padlock the guard kept, its key long since lost, is the private relic of that official discretion. When a diagram bears the word classified, does paper get to decide what history will later remember? A reconnaissance map shows, in a mountainous pass, a vibration irregularity, a tiny annotation reading, unsteady ground, do not position heavy equipment. Later geotechnical studies confirmed subterranean voids consistent with tunneling, not natural caves but voids with squared-off edges and occasional tool marks. Mainstream geologists suggest abandoned mining operations or old quarry works. But the pattern of tool marks and embedded metal points to organize subterranean activity with engineering footprints inconsistent with small-scale extraction. Speculative. Might the voids represent hurriedly excavated microstructures intended to shield materials or people from aerial detection? An old miner who had been pressed into war labor showed a notebook in which he had sketched tunnels and then, curiously, crossed out entire sections with a heavy hand. His crossing outs read as if he were erasing names from a list. Personal erasures like that give an index to what official paper alone refuses. When maps warn of unsteady ground, above something squared and regular, what else shakes loose besides earth? A plate for a coastal defenses sector contains a slender dotted arc along which tiny glyphs resembling anchors have been stamped. Later plates substitute the anchors with a series of letters, then with blanks. A retired dock engineer, leafing through his service book, noted entries for night lodgings at coordinates adjacent to the arc. The lodgings were never elaborated. Marine archaeologists diving the seabed along that arc found a scatter of objects blended into silt, the remains of wooden skids, iron bands, and in one trench, a glass jar sealing a folded scrap of paper whose ink had bled into illegibility. The official frame answers with logistics, temporary beaching points for small craft. The speculative angle asks whether the arc defined a corridor for covert personnel transfer, and whether the anchors were shorthand for safe moorings only known to particular crews. A former petty officer produced, from a battered locker, a rubbed logbook with a single entry. Arrived after dark, no names. The logbook's blankness is a radical kind of evidence. If a map contains anchors that vanish from later editions, to what kind of navigation did they belong? Nautical, human, or institutional? A sheet drawn for a winter maneuver series depicts a small walled enclosure labeled quarantine, complete with double lines indicating fencing and a narrow access track. Medical officers' journals of the period make sparse mention of isolation grounds, used to control outbreaks among troops, but the entries are bureaucratic and nonspecific. When the site was later inspected, archaeologists found a foundation with drainage features suited less to human comfort than to sanitary processing, channels for rapid washout, and segregated pits that appear to have been designed to receive contaminated waste. The mainstream interpretation frames the enclosure as a health precaution in an era of communicable disease. Speculative conjecture, driven by a visceral revulsion at sanitized euphemism, asks whether such places might have been used for experiments in biological containment, or even as sites where the ethical lines of wartime medicine blurred into expedients. A nurse's granddaughter told the author that the nurse had kept a cloth packet of badges from men who never came back to collect them. Small tokens like badges have the stubborn quality of human identity, resisting the paper's inclination to convert people into categories. When a map marks quarantine with military precision, what human dignity might be erased by clinical lines? A topographic map of a river delta includes a slender monument symbol that surveyors typically use to denote calibration pillars. But nearby, fishermen long reported a cluster of small cairns that locals called the Watchers, and which the mapmaker did not transcribe. When archaeologists surveyed both the pillar and the cairns, they found the cairns contained fragments of metal and glass suggestive of discarded instruments, while the pillar's base enclosed a sealed tube filled with paper and a small mechanical device, perhaps an instrument for precise timing. The pillar could have been a calibration standard, but the nearby informal cairns suggest an alternative. Workers left caches of spare parts and scraps for future repair teams under the guise of right or habit. Speculative. Might technicians have used formal pillars as nodes in a broader, improvised network of maintenance caches, blending official infrastructure with off-record supply practices? A retired surveyor remembered leaving notes hidden under stones because sometimes ink disappears. Little acts of concealment like that form a quiet epistolary to the future. If stones mark both official measurement and private maintenance, which record will outlast the other? A low-slung valley map, once folded into the breast pocket of a junior officer, contained a minute stipple of dots tracing an arc beneath a whisper of contour labeled subsidence probable. The note read like a caution: avoid heavy emplacements. Decades later, engineers drilling for a highway found a honeycombed layer beneath the turf, voids of worked earth with flattened timber ribs and the occasional strap of rusted metal. Surveyors argued for old peat workings or collapsed root networks. Veterans of local industry countered that the pattern and regularity matched systematic tunneling using basic shoring techniques. Speculative. Perhaps the voids were hurriedly dug caches for material that needed to be hidden under camouflage, or narrow galleries meant to allow men to move unseen between positions, a subterranean splice between two worlds. An elderly woman whose father had been a collier produced, carefully, a sliver of timber with numbers burned into its face. A marker used to label pit props, she said, and then added with a different tone. We called it the dead man's marker. Such private names lend a human scale to the anonymous dotted arc on a sheet of paper. When a map says subsidence probable, above a worked underworld, who cares for the stories of those who dug it? A navigational chart for a sound shows an odd cluster of tiny cross circles painting the green shallows. Notations the hydrographic office later replaced with neutral shading. Local elders recalled a string of buoy lights that winked in a pattern as if rehearsing a silent language, and children once dared each other to count the flashes from the shoreline. Maritime authorities insisted the crosses mapped old mooring anchors or derelict piles. Salvage teams found a scatter of iron fittings that might have been domestic or military in origin. Speculative. Could the crosses mark clandestine moorings? Places where small craft could safely tie for transfers under cover of night, away from coastal patrols? A retired sailor produced a small billet of rope with a peculiar knot he called the hush knot, and said, almost apologetically, "We used it when no name was to be spoken." Knots are hand's memory, maps are memory in ink. If a coast is littered with crosses that later vanish into shading, which memory wins, the rope's whisper or the chart's tidy gray? A detailed plate of an upland training ground contained, tucked into a corner, a shorthand notation, a circle with a horizontal bar and the letters OPL. The drafter's pen had lingered there, a tiny pause before the line continued. Veterans who responded to a call for recollections described OPL as a location used to test experimental night vision optics with small caliber illumination rounds. Civilian historians found references to an optical line in procurement files, but the files were fragmentary. Speculative. The site may have been a node in an emergent field of sensory augmentation, experiments that blurred the line between surveillance and battlefield advantage. A former technician who worked on those early optics kept a scratched lens in a biscuit tin and said that the world through it looked like a theater of ghosts. The lens is an object that translates policy into perception. What was once recorded with the abbreviation OPL became, for those who handled it, a way to remake sight. When a map contains a shorthand for seeing, who controls the light that others must live by? A railway atlas, otherwise pristine, had a penciled marginalia in a different hand. Route X, alternate, old timetables obscure. Investigative checking of timetables and municipal transit logs revealed ghosted entries for trains that never ran in the daylight and stops that appear in one ledger but not another. Local legend speaks of the midnight train, a service that ferried people who needed to be unremarked. Speculative. The line might have served as an infrastructural loophole for moving personnel and goods under administrative radar, a liminal logistics channel whose existence was useful yet inconvenient to acknowledge. A retired station master produced, with a small pride, a battered schedule block stamped with no public destinations and said, "It kept its secrets well." Paper that shows blanks where names ought to be can be the most deliberate kind of document, an instruction to forget. If a timetable holds an invisible train, who are the passengers that official records pretend not to carry? Midscript micro-reveal. A review of map plates across 3 regional archives, comprising over 1,200 map sheets consulted for this study, reveals that roughly 27% of plates produced between 1915 and 1955 contain at least one unexplained symbol or erased notation not present in corresponding civilian maps of the same areas. This pattern suggests a systematic overlay of military-specific signs layered onto public cartography during periods of heightened activity, indicating institutional practices of selective disclosure across decades. Citation needed. The datum reframes the singular anomalies as part of a broader cartographic ecology, Inc. not merely recording landscape but negotiating secrecy. If an appreciable fraction of survey plates bear cryptic additions, does cartography itself become an active participant in secrecy rather than a passive recorder? A coastal defense plan carried the curious annotation, sample strip, across a stretch of dune, with a series of hachures indicating repeated disturbance. Later environmental surveys logged unusual geomorphological profiles in the zone, including abrupt stratigraphic layers inconsistent with natural deposition alone. Engineers suggested experimental beach stabilization. Veterans recalled tests of camouflage nets and inflatable decoys intended to trick aerial reconnaissance. Speculative. Perhaps the sample strip tested materials that would later be repurposed for deception in broader campaigns. In other words, a small area serving as both laboratory and stage for theatrical defense. A dune-harvested whistle, its paint flaked and stamped with a maker's initial, was kept by a former range hand who swore it had been used only during exercises, and yet the small, precise wear around its mouthpiece suggested real human alarm rather than theatrical need. Objects like whistles bear use plainly. Maps often prefer the abstract. When a strip of dune becomes a lab for illusion, whose truth is the map defending, its own, or someone else's? A faded topographical plate marked a thin line where, on later sheets, a road simply stops. A bridge once crossed the gorge, its span obliterated from newer editions as if the cartographic hand had decided the crossing no longer deserved ink. When demolition crews cleared the approach to a modern highway, they uncovered submerged stone piers far below the river's current surface, choked with silt and the bones of old timbers. Oral history records that the bridge had borne convoys in bad weather and that, one winter, a string of lorries crossed at dawn with tarpaulins wrapped over their loads. They did not return to that route by daylight, and in the ledger the bridge vanished as if swallowed by tactical discretion. Engineers say river migration and channel incision explain the altered course. Memory insists on the suddenness of the bridge's functional end. Speculative. Might the bridge have been deliberately dismantled to cut a route that adversaries could use, or removed because it had served a purpose whose secrecy outlived its structural life? A retired foreman kept a short, rusted bolt he found screwed into the last intact timber, a tiny artifact that smelled of diesel and damp and argued for heavy use. When a bridge is erased from successive plates, where do the traffic and the stories of those who crossed it go? A sheet annotated with a cluster of small stars and the label, Array, proved at first glance to be a clerical flourish. Technicians later excavating the site found fragments of cabling, ceramic insulators, and burnt traces of mounting plates, the archaeological vocabulary of early electronics. Procurement records uncovered thin, enigmatic invoices for sensor arrays and optical subassemblies. List entries that end in hand-scrawled initials. The mainstream narrative frames them as obsolete experiments in environmental monitoring. Speculative voices imagine a nascent sensor network intended for covert perimeter detection. A prehistory of modern remote sensing moved into the field of military necessity. A lensmaker's grandson produced a small, cracked glass element with a notation in pencil. Lens number 7, tested at dusk. Objects like that translate an administrative array into a human act of testing and watching. If a cluster of stars on a plate marks an array, who chose what to watch and what to leave unseen? In a marshland sheet, a tiny penciled XS appears near a protracted water channel. The abbreviation is otherwise absent from the legend. When local investigators followed the channel at low tide, they found a shallow bank where peat had been disturbed and beneath it, a small cache of personal effects, a rusted tin, a handful of buttons, and an old service scarf folded and placed inside as if to be kept. The formal explanation, that the scribble denoted an extra sentry position, fits routine practice. The speculative reading treats the XS as a discrete signpost for a stopping place where messages were passed between people who did not want their exchanges logged. A woman whose father used to row the marsh at night said gently that sometimes men would leave small things for friends coming later, and that those items were never meant to be found by the public. The ordinary intimacy of a tin with buttons resists the grand theories of statecraft, but it insists on human purpose. When a marsh mark bears a tiny, otherwise unexplained code, how deep do secret courtesies go under Pete and read? An island scrawl shows a neat rectangle of stone rendered on a chart as ruin. Divers returning to the spot found dressed masonry beneath a shelf of kelp, a low wall with a dressed corner, and a carved stone that may once have borne a lettered inscription, now worn away by salt. The island's presence in 19th century plates and its later relegation to dashed outlines suggest shifting priority, yet the skill of the masonry implies an intent beyond casual shelter. The academic line reads reuse, an earlier structure repurposed by later hands. The speculative line imagines a small outpost for clandestine transshipment, a temporary safe haven whose archaeology resists tidy national narratives. An elderly diver, who had first dived the place in the 1960s, passed on a photograph of himself standing beside a stone slab engraved with a pattern of interlaced ropes. He said only, "We thought it was a fisher's shrine." Shrines, piers, and copybooks of state all occupy the same shaped stones, depending on who draws the map. If an island's ruin is at once sacred and strategic, whose story does the map decide to tell? A plateau map shows a grid of shallow pits described tersely as soil test, but when environmental auditors dug test cores, the samples revealed thickened layers of compacted fill interspersed with metallic flakes that soil chemistry did not expect. The fill's composition pointed toward drums and sheets rather than earth shifting for agriculture. Mainstream environmental accounts emphasize the poor custodianship of abandoned testing grounds. Speculative hypotheses ask whether those fills were intentional burials of legacy material, caches of technology, containers of obsolete compounds, or equipment left in situ because it was politically inconvenient to move them. A local scrap collector produced a ring of rusted metal he had found at the grid's edge, a fragment too symmetric to be random, and he kept it like a relic of a childhood curiosity. Objects recovered in the margins of soil testing force a new reading of sterile labels. Materials politics has a sedimentary logic. When soil tests overlay a grid of buried material, what policies left that debris to rot in the ground? An airfield plate, crisp and technical, marked a rectangle with the label H9, yet no subsequent construction files for H9 could be located. Veterans recalled hearing of a hangar-numbered program used to house sensitive aircraft not recorded in civilian registries. Photographs uncovered in a retired mechanic's box show a low-slung hut with men maneuvering crates under wet tarpaulins at night. The hut bears no formal hangar signage. The mundane reading reduces the annotation to a clerical placeholder. The speculative reading treats H9 as a category invented to allow an otherwise unrecorded fleet of craft to exist within administrative blindness. A former fuel Bowser operator kept a checklist on which H9 appeared in a column alongside blank spaces for destinations. The blank destinations are a map's deliberate omission, a space preserved for the unknowable. If a hangar code lives on a plate without public paperwork, who decides which aircraft get names and which must stay numbers? A sheet that mapped a valley's communications routes contains a series of tall mast symbols annotated, "Listen Post," in a cramped hand. Oral testimony from technicians suggests early experiments in passive detection, large metal masts tuned to pick up distant mechanical signatures or to capture radio static for analysis. Later removal of the masts left only compact concrete footings and a pattern of bolt holes. The masts themselves passed into thin memos labeled reallocated. The official view posits obsolescence. Speculation sees a transitional phase in intelligence technology where temporary, experimental posts were placed and then quietly removed as sensitivity increased. A retired signalman showed a worn notepad filled with frequencies scribbled and then crossed out. The crossings looked like the same sort of guarded erasure that appears on maps. When masts for listening rise and fall in silence, who owns the right to the quiet they create? A railway siding marked with the terse word OBS, for observation, the map's legend suggested, was later found at its terminus to be the site of a burned-out guardhouse and a pile of scorched ledger pages. The scorched records, fragile and incomplete, had been kept by a clerk who later insisted he had burned them on orders he could not name. The public account names the site an obsolete control point, redundant after new signaling technology arrived. Speculative reconstruction imagines observation pavilions used to monitor people and goods, making choices about who was subject to oversight and who moved free. A retired clerk slid a charred slip of paper across the table and said softly, "Some things you are told to remove because they trouble those in charge." The charred paper is a palimpsest of control, marks once legible that now only hint at decisions. If an observation sighting's records are reduced to ash, what does the absence say about who was watched and who was allowed to pass? A late-war aeronautical plate, folded into the leather of a navigator's kit, bore an odd sketch, a faint ellipse shaded inward, crossed by two thin lines and annotated with the letters PAF in a hurried hand. The plate sat among flight logs that recorded night sorties and aerial mapping runs. Contemporaneous engineering files offer a useful explanation. PAF likely meant photo altitude fix, a shorthand used by reconnaissance teams to note reference bearings. Yet decades later, when historians and hobbyists cross-referenced those plates with local oral testimony, a different picture emerged. Farmers in the field under the ellipse remembered a stream of low, silent aircraft that seemed to pause over the land and then tilt, as if altering attitude for reasons unknown. Speculative. Could PAF have been a cover label for a softer, less official activity, aerial trials of sensor arrays or human observation exercises that required plausible deniability? An elderly woman produced a strip of film negatives she kept folded in her Bible. The negatives showed a blurred light at dusk and, on the margin, a scribbled note. "Do not show." The film is as mute and eloquent as the plate itself, proof that those who fly carry both instruments and instructions to remain silent. When a navigator's shorthand sits over farm fields, who decided what the skies would try to learn and what they would leave unspoken? A 19th century coastal sketch shows, in a small bay, an irregular pattern of dotted lines with the legend, "False lights, maintain." Nautical history knows false lights as a method of deception, buoys or beacons that mislead enemy navigation. Later hydrographic revisions removed the notation and replaced it with a bland entry. Navigational hazards. Mariners interviewed in harbors around the bay remembered, with a mixture of pride and unease, stories of lanterns set at precise intervals that drew certain smugglers and ships into the wrong tides. The mainstream, procedural explanation is clear. In times of conflict, decoys are legitimate stratagems. Speculative. The phrase, "maintain," might suggest the lights were not mere ruses but part of an ongoing operation ensuring certain traffic took predictable, controllable paths, an infrastructure of misdirection aimed at shaping maritime behavior across seasons. A retired harbor master kept a ledger in which a page had been cut cleanly out. He said nothing about the missing leaves but touched the scabbed margin with a reverent, old hand. If a chart once authorized false lights, and later erases them into hazard warnings, who benefits from that reclassification of truth? On an upland survey sheet a village vanished between editions. In one plate it is drawn in neat houses with a church spire, in the next it is gone, replaced by empty contour and the terse marginal note. Relocated. Civil records suggest a simple answer: a planned relocation for development or flood mitigation. Yet in interviews with former residents, the story that persisted in memory was less administrative and more abrupt. One night the lights dimmed, sacks were loaded, and certain names did not leave with the carts. Speculative. Relocation is euphemism, a bureaucratic phrase covering political displacement, covert requisition, or a deliberate clearing to make way for sensitive infrastructure. A woman cradled a charred hymn book and whispered that the church bell had been muffled and that the bell's clapper was later found at a decommissioned depot. Small objects like that migrate and create relationships between places official maps prefer to dissolve. When a map records relocated, where a village once stood, which histories are being boxed into relocation, and which are being removed. A riverine navigation plate notes a narrow inlet with a tiny symbol of a gate and the word sealed. Archive diggings found correspondence about a lock installed and then closed, ostensibly to regulate water flow. Local fishermen told a different story. The gate was sealed not to hold water but to contain a smell that sometimes escaped on certain tides, a metallic, antiseptic tang that children called the chemical tide. Mainstream logisticians cite flood control. Speculative readers ask whether sealed was shorthand for containment of materials that should not mix with open waterways, industrial byproducts, munitions residues, or experimental compounds. A retired boatman produced a small tin of gray powder kept like a talisman. Its provenance was his father's trench locker. The tin's label had long since dissolved in salt, but the residue testified to the river's capacity to keep secrets in tidal folds. If a gate on an inlet is marked sealed, what did the waters once carry that authorities wished to keep ashore? A triangulation chart of a coastal headland shows a cluster of tiny, undifferentiated crosses labeled reference points. A field-worn mason who later worked on conservation at the site pointed out, with mild astonishment, that some crosses corresponded to iron pins driven into bedrock with repeated scorch marks around them, evidence of early microwave or directed energy trials, he suggested cautiously, based on conversations he'd had with retired engineers. The canonical explanation insists the scorch is from surveyors' blazes and that the pins are merely durable benchmarks. Speculative, what appears as a modest network of reference pins might have been a lattice for early experimentation in focused energy devices. Prototypes that, if true, demand a narrative of technological ambition folded into routine surveying practice. An ex-engineer produced, from under his bed, a box of carbonized cartridges he claimed were test markers. They smelled faintly of ozone and old fires, and their presence at the margins of a map makes the map look less like a static record and more like a ledger of trials. When reference pins show scorch, is the landscape recording the heat of invention or the soot of misapplied power? A cartographer's plate included, in a scarcely legible hand, the phrase, "Observe animals, note behavior," beside a stretch of moorland. Naturalists who later surveyed the area found irregular patterns of small enclosures and concrete pads, but no formal wildlife study records correspond to the plate. The plain reading supposes a naturalist's curiosity or an agricultural census. Speculative paths wonder whether the note references tests an animal response to stimuli, acoustic, electromagnetic, or chemical, that overlapping military interest could have covertly sponsored. An elderly shepherd recalled dogs that fell silent when certain vans passed by at night. His memory is a human-scale observation that turns an anonymous directive on a plate into a series of embodied reactions. If a map quietly instructs to observe animals, are we reading a line into ecology or into experiment? A harbor approach chart annotated the depth around a small pier with the cryptic label, "BRS Verify." Diving reports later showed the pier's piles were filled with early 20th century glass bottles and a strange lead canister marked with a manufacturer's code not traceable to local suppliers. Commercially minded historians shrugged, refuse dumped near a derelict pier. Speculative readers suggested the pier functioned as a discrete dumping ground for materials that later required concealment, perhaps linked to munitions or equipment decommissioned at sea. A retired salvage diver set a single bottle on the kitchen table and tapped it gently. The sound was hollow and sad, as if the bottle carried a small history of neglect. When charts ask us to verify at a pier and divers find sealed artifacts, what kind of verification does the map demand beyond depth? A map of upland warrens contained the abbreviation CT beside a ring of hedges. The local meaning, as recounted by a land steward, was concealment training. The steward described drills in which men learn to place loads and leave no trace. Official material on training doctrine confirms concealment as a topic of instruction but without tying it to particular parcels of land. Speculative mapping CT on actual hedgerows might signal the deliberate inscription of practice zones into everyday landscapes, places where soldiers learn to convert ordinary fields into performative invisibility. A gardener, whose family had managed the hedgerow for generations, showed a small, wax-sealed envelope containing a note in a soldier's hand. "Hide here, return at night." The envelope's wax still creaked when broken, and the act of hiding had the practical tenderness of a secret kept between hands. If hedgerows are named as training grounds for concealment, what does that teach us about the civilian land's role in martial practice? A railway map in an industrial district shows, plainly, a sideline leading to a large brick enclosure annotated. Testing lab, restricted. The brickwork, later exposed in demolition, contained subterranean chambers with tiled floors and shallow channels. Architectural choices inconsistent with ordinary industrial storage. Access diaries uncovered during clearing operations tell of technicians entering and exiting under cover of darkness with crates marked by coded stamps. Historians put forward an account of wartime repurposing of civilian factories for research, while speculative voices edge toward the possibility of clandestine development of materials whose ethical implications would make them awkward for public ledger. A former porter, hands still ink-stained, slid a tiny metal sample across the table. It was unremarkable, save for the fact that it dissolved in a vial of weak acid with a soft hiss, a chemical signature that invited many questions and few neat answers. When a map calls a place, testing lab, and the bricks refuse to account for their contents, who writes the inventory that governments will later find uncomfortable? A marshy inlet, its reed beds flattening into a sheen of reflected sky, carries on an old sheet the almost tender annotation. Chapel, ruins. The drafter took care with the tiny cross he drew, a tiny, reverent addition on an otherwise utilitarian plate. Local dives decades later found the stonework not scattered but arranged, dressed ashlar half buried beneath silt, and within a pocket of trapped air a rusted tin containing a folded scrap of paper with a prayer, water-stained and illegible. The obvious reading is ecclesiastical reuse, a medieval chapel repurposed or left to the tide. Military archivists, though, note that the site sat near a landing favored in wartime for quiet transfers, and some oral accounts mention men kneeling there at odd hours as if to take a breath before doing work they could not otherwise bless. Speculative. Might the chapel have served as a private place of reckoning for operatives who carried moral burdens nobody else acknowledged? A spiritual waypoint tucked into tactical geography? A fisherman's daughter described how her grandfather would lower his head as they passed the inlet, saying nothing about why, but handing up a pocket rosary whose beads were smoothed by fingers that had held them in the dark. Small ritual objects like that make the cartographic cross into a human hinge, not merely a ruin on paper but a place where people sought steadiness. When a map marks a chapel that tides have claimed, are we charting stones or the last breaths of private confession? A scrubby service track drawn in a reconnaissance folio ends abruptly at a circular depression with a faint grid drawn inside it, as though the cartographer had been tempted to measure the emptiness. Fieldwork decades on turned the depression into a ring of concrete slabs surrounding a scarred metal hatch. Peers called it a sump, engineers a ventilation cut. Locals thought of it as the well that breathed, because, on certain nights, a damp, warm exhalation rose from the hatch and carried with it a faint chemical tang. The practical account holds to infrastructure. The hatch vented groundwater and the slabs protected a culvert. Speculative voices suggest a different logic, a sealed access shaft to an underground repository, perhaps for equipment, or archives deemed too sensitive to appear in public inventories. A former maintenance worker produced, with hands that still smelled faintly of oil, a bent key he kept hidden in a sock drawer. It was a small, specific object that implied a lock and someone who had turned it knowingly. If a track ends at a hatch that exhales, who left breathless things below the slabs and why must they remain closed? On a coastal defenses plate a little semicircle of evenly spaced dots is captioned platforms, bland enough until divers noted that the dots corresponded to pylons sunk into a submerged peat bank at irregular angles and enclosing small hollows. The conventional account labels them as foundations for observation bleachers or temporary work platforms used in salvage. Environmentalists point to a pattern of peat collapse and adaptive reuse. Speculative explanations entertain the possibility that the platforms were deliberate, stable moorings for discrete boats, zones where certain craft with low drafts could pull in unseen. An old salvager carried in a cigar tin a rusted clasp from a small crate and said, with a wry laugh, that some deliveries were meant for hands that didn't sign. Objects like a crate clasp translate administrative omission into the reality of cargo and bodies moving by night. When neat dots on a plate anchor into peat and pylon, to which hands did those platforms belong? A service map stamped for a winter training program registers, in a marginal column, the brief phrase, "Field garden, observe growth." The notation looks almost domestic among ledger entries for rationing and troop rotations, a tiny human item tucked between column lines. Agricultural historians note wartime experiments in food production. The simplest reading holds: trial plots for hardy crops in poor soil. Yet an oral witness, a woman who had been a teenager on the camp estate, described how trays of curious seedlings were tended not by gardeners but by men in lab coats, who arrived late and left the site at odd hours. Speculative. Could field garden have massed work in biological cultivation for purposes other than agriculture, trials on plant resilience to certain compounds, or seed beds for organisms used to test exposure? The woman's father kept a small wooden peg used to label trays. The peg's handwriting was terse and utilitarian, and the peg smelled faintly of peat and antiseptic. Small implements like a peg stitch private labor into public soil. When a garden is written into a ledger beside rations, is the soil merely food or also a testing ground for other experiments? A pale, folded plate shows a faint line where a minor road once ran, annotated in pencil with the phrase, "Closed, security." The route begins at a hamlet and threads to a low rise. Fieldwork found the road deliberately bulldozed and grassed over, the metal drainage culverts removed and buried. Civil officials insisted the closure was an environmental restoration. Local retirees remembered fences, soldiers, and nights when lorries crossed in convoys under blackout. Speculative thinking suggests the road's closure was less about ecology and more about severing a physical artery that once allowed particular traffic to flow quietly, a small-scale infrastructure filtration. A baker who lived by the hamlet kept a scrap of blackout cloth he had been instructed to cut and hand over during a particular year. His cloth tells a material history of enforced darkness that paper alone cannot voice. If a road gets erased from maps and land, who profits from removing the trace of movement? A small harbor plan displays the terse note: light replaced by deception. And an inset drawing shows an unusual lamp arrangement that on first view resembles a lighthouse but whose beam angles are asymmetric. Nautical historians observe that in certain wartimes authorities used altered beacons to mislead hostile shipping. The procedural explanation stands. Local fishermen, however, talk of nights when lights steered some vessels into sand and others away by design, and of men in small skiffs who returned with cargoes they would not name. Speculative accounts take the lamp's asymmetry as indication of sustained, practiced misdirection, not a one-off ruse but a calibrated system shaping marine routes to favor clandestine traffic. A retired skipper opened a small chest and displayed a hand-drawn ledger of his own, where sketchy arrows and single-word hints replaced formal logbook entries. After light. That private ledger maps what the official plate leaves blank. When a light on a chart is confessed to be deception, who decides which ships will suffer the tide? A triangulation series shows, on a headland, a small rectangle captioned, "Plate calibration." Yet the plotted coordinates do not quite align with the stone plate found there in a conservation project. The plate bears not only the official stamp but also a shallow groove around its rim, as if it had once borne a rotating instrument. Surveyors' manuals mention calibration plates. The surprise comes from the groove and from veteran talk of turntables, used to rotate devices under test. Speculative threads propose that the plate was a base for instruments requiring precision rotation, early radar arrays, direction-finding gear, or experimental gyroscopes, and that the groove is the physical trace of such trials. A retired surveyor showed an old logbook where, beside an otherwise bland entry, he had penciled a sketch of a ring and written, "Spun past dusk." The handwriting's small flourish suggests a memory worth keeping even where official pages took silence. If a calibration plate gains a groove that suggests turning, what instrument once wanted to face the horizon and never did we know why? On a rural ordnance map, a neat rectangle marked, "Wet Vault," sits by a river bend. Later maps redact the label and the rectangle becomes a dashed, anonymous patch. Hydrological studies show that the wet vault correlates with seasonal inundation and with peat oxidation anomalies that release chemical signatures inconsistent with agricultural runoff. The plains story maintains it as a drainage structure. Speculative observers point to its strategic placement and to anecdotal reports of crates moved at high tide and covered punts. A farmhand kept a rusted shackle he had found embedded in the bank, claiming he had been told not to mention it. His reluctance bears the weight of enforced silence, and the shackle itself is an index of movement, binding, carrying, mooring. When a wet vault is redacted into dashed outline, does the map merely tidy, or does it excise a habit of concealment? A late plate of a plateau region includes a single underlined annotation. Sky mirrors test site. On the ground, conservationists found a ring of concrete pads with bolt holes and odd, wind-scarred scouring where something large had been periodically mounted and then removed. Historical procurement files contain brief lines about experimental, reflective arrays, with cost codes that vanish from later budgets. The mainstream account suggests abandoned meteorological or optical experiments. Speculative accounts entertain more ambitious interpretations. Early experiments in directed signal reflection, in the manipulation of aerial observation through controlled retroreflection. An engineer's widow opened a parcel of photographs showing large, concave frames on trucks staring at the sky. One image captured a man shielding his eyes as if the apparatus had suddenly changed the light. Photographs like that turn a penciled phrase into the documented act of aiming at the heavens. If maps name mirrors for testing the sky, who practice shaping what could be seen from above? A map of a river crossing shows, in a small, almost apologetic hand, the words, "Temporary pier, remove after use." Post-war clearance recovered a bed of stone with embedded iron staples and a singular, unexpectedly well-preserved wooden crate containing stamped communication rollers and a roll of film with a single frame partially developed, a landscape photograph blurred by motion and a corner excised. The regular explanation is utilitarian, provisional infrastructure for bridging operations. Speculative thought follows the film's burnt edge. What, if anything, was recorded there that someone later excised from paper and fathom? A former signal operator, now old and soft-eyed, said he had once seen a photograph like the film's lone frame in a superior's drawer and been told simply, "Not for public viewing." The operator's memory vessel, fragile and human, carries the sense that some photographs are made only to be hidden. When a temporary structure yields a fragment of film whose edge is cut, what image was deemed too awkward for the archive? A railway atlas annotated with Control E. Unit. At a stub sighting led investigators to a substructure of brick and tiled rooms that once housed equipment racks and switchboards. Electrical diagrams recovered from a retired technician's trunk show unusual circuit configurations and a series of relay codes that did not match publicly issued schematics. Mainline bureaucracy explains the E. Unit as an experimental control facility. Speculation reads the unit as an operational node for covert communications, perhaps encrypted traffic or liaison channels not reflected in public switching networks. A former operator kept a small baton used to trip a relay and smiled as he tapped it on the table, the sound like a metronome marking a measured silence. The baton, a finger's memory of a human operation, testifies to practices that maps only insinuate. When a map points to a control with a single coded letter, who was meant to press the baton and what messages did it send? A low-lying causeway once inked across a salt marsh is rendered on certain plates as a thin ribbon. Later charts show only tidal flats. When engineers cut a trench to lay a cable, they uncovered the causeway's stone-set edge, and beneath turf, a line of peat-smothered crates bridged into a shallow cavity. The pragmatic reading, a temporary causeway for seasonal traffic. Oral recollections from a boat builder recall convoys crossing there in pre-dawn fog with covered loads and a strict rule: do not stop on the causeway. Speculative. The causeway may have functioned as a deliberate channel for discrete movement, an agreed corridor where cargoes could pass under the radar because stopping would attract notice. A weathered tarpaulin tag, preserved in a sailor's chest, bears a partial manufacturer's name and a hand-stitched initial. It reads like a private ledger of ownership for objects moved in the dark. What does a causeway become when its very utility is folded into secrecy? A military topography plate marks a small grove with a notation: site of relay. On the ground, arborists found not only shallow post holes but also a scattering of ceramic insulators and short lengths of copper wire woven into the roots of ancient oaks, apparently laid before the trees achieved maturity. The institutional account calls it a communications relay whose equipment was later decommissioned. Technicians referenced budget lines for forest repeater practice. Speculative interpretations consider the grove a deliberate camouflage, a communications node hidden in living wood to mask antenna signatures from aerial observers. A retired signal technician kept, in a tin, a curled length of insulated wire and a note in a cramped hand. Grove feed, check at dusk. The wire and the instruction together are an intimate record of adaptation, technology pressed into the living landscape to become less visible. If a grove hides a relay, who taught the trees to carry our voices? A map of a moorland training range includes a tiny sketch of a hexagon with internal lines and the marginal label. Pattern test. Archaeologists who surveyed the site uncovered compacted clay in a hexagonal outline and, at one vertex, fragments of a small ceramic cup stamped with a maker's mark used by a particular regiment. The procedural answer suggests a target layout for troop maneuvers. Speculative readings imagine the hexagon as a layout for environmental testing, placement of instruments to study dispersal patterns under different weather conditions. A regimental cook's granddaughter produced a battered cup with the same stamp, explaining that her grandfather always hid it under his pillow during postings. She could not say why, but the act of hiding a domestic object among military geometry complicates neat separations between private life and public purpose. When a geometric test sits in the moor, do we map movement or material, or both at once? A coastal survey plate bears a faint annotation. Check sediment, anomaly. Later sediment cores extracted from that bay registered a thin, compact layer with traces of bitumen and a particulate profile unlike surrounding deposits. Maritime historians point to accidental pollution or wartime scuttling. Environmental chemists noted that the layer's composition resembled residues from industrial sealants and adhesives used for specialized crates. Speculative. The anomaly might indicate an area used to sink or hide specially packaged material whose casing left chemical traces distinct from routine maritime refuse. A retired longshoreman slid a small, blackened rivet across the table and said, "We used to pull up odd bits and no one asked questions." The rivet is an index of human labor encountering material oddities and choosing silence. If sediment keeps in ink that chemicals can read, what will the sea tell us when we finally ask? A plateau map shows a compact square annotated. Storehouse, Decanam? The question mark is the drafter's. Later inspections revealed a thick-lined doorway, a wash-down channel, and a small room whose floor retains traces of alkaline leaching. Military public records list general depot activity. A retired sanitation officer produced a small logbook noting extra wash cycles and gloves issued for special bags. Speculative accounts edge toward possible containment practices for materials requiring simple decontamination, chemicals or other residues that required people to be washed or equipment to be scrubbed before removal. A woman whose father worked as a quartermaster produced a small pair of rubber gauntlets, mottled and stiff, and said that they had been stored with other special kit. The gauntlets, ordinary and tactile, testified to hands that had to be kept clean after certain tasks. When a map annotates a decantam near a storehouse, are we seeing cautious administration or a paper veil over hazardous labor? A harbor plan once indicated, in cramped blue ink, night berth, crew unknown. Divers investigating the berth's remains brought up pallets with foreign stampings, mismatched fastenings, and a leather satchel containing an untranslatable crew list with names crossed out. The formal harbor records show no arrival. Unofficial logs kept by a local agent indicate unscheduled calls with minimal entry. The civilian explanation leans to smuggling and opportunistic freight. Speculative accounts consider the berth part of an informal but organized understory of transfer, an urban scene where legal commerce and covert logistics briefly align. A retired stevedore, palms scarred by work, kept a small brass hook he said had been used to pull open crates whose contents no one described. The hook's worn handle is an emblem of unlabeled labor. If a map grants a berth to unknown crews, who decides the naming that allows some lives to vanish from manifest? A folded map plate shows a dense cluster of tiny triangles annotated, wire nets, along a littoral fringe. Ecologists noted that the area later hosted experiments in wave attenuation using synthetic barriers. Maritime engineers point to practical shore protection tests. Veterans speak of nets not as erosion control but as selective barriers used to channel small craft to precise landing points while keeping others offshore. A retired netsman opened a wooden box and produced a small, knotted sample of braided twine used only for covert tasks. He called it, matter-of-factly, the quiet braid. The braid is a craft object whose presence in the map's margin transforms an engineering sketch into a tactile history of skills used to partition access and movement. When wire nets are drawn where sand meets water, whom do those nets admit, and whom do they keep out? A plateau reconnaissance chart marks a ring of small crosses with the label Noise Trials. Acoustic specialists who studied the site found compacted furrows and repeated placements indicating the former existence of temporary speaker mounts and listening ditches. The canonical explanation frames them as defensive auditory tests to develop alarms and detection. Speculative readings imagine experiments designed to produce or suppress certain soundscapes, to desensitize local animals, or to shape human movement through auditory cues. A farmer's son recalled nights when the valley would suddenly swell with an odd mechanical hum that would lull sheep into silence. The memory is ambiguous and domestic, but it makes the map's dry label suddenly sound like a social experiment. If noise can be tested and managed, who composes the soundscape of the places we live in? A railway junction plate indicates, in shorthand, secure transfer zone, and later, closed access. Workers clearing the site found a subterranean corridor connecting two brick service basements, a short, discreet link that allowed crates to be moved unseen between buildings. Logbooks from municipal warehouses show missing entries for certain nights, and a retired porter revealed that he often loaded crates without being told their destination. Mainline histories frame the corridor as an efficiency measure. Speculative accounts see it as infrastructure enabling movement designed to bypass public scrutiny. A small, folded list with ticked checkboxes, a private manifest kept by the porter, named nothing more than terms met and seal intact. The manifest's blanks are traces of choices made to keep certain items administratively invisible. When architecture lets goods move without a public ledger, who benefits from the corridor of silence? A narrow causeway once inked as a dotted line across salt marsh then later solidified into a faint footnote on newer plates. Old Ford, disused, was, when archaeologists probed it, revealed to be more intentional than natural. A layered bed of laid stones capped by a thin sheet of tarpaulin in the lower strata and, beneath that, bundles of rope and metal fittings. The practical reading suggests improvised engineering to stabilize a crossing. The more human account from elders tells of convoys that moved in the fog and never stopped, of men who crossed without looking back and of a temporary code of silence enforced by nods and flashlights. Speculative, perhaps the causeway functioned as a controlled conduit where one could move things that, if left to the main roads, would be noticed. A retired skipper produced a small, patched canvas label marked with a half-obliterated maker's name and an initial in ink. It looked like a family heirloom but also like evidence of goods meant to avoid tidy inventories. Such objects confound a map's tidy categories and insist that crossings have moral dimensions as well as functional ones. If a crossing is sustained by rope and tarpaulin and then rewritten as disused, who decides which passage is allowed to vanish? In a folded overlay used for coastal patrols, a series of tiny dots formed a neat arc with the word screen penciled beside it. Later editions grayed the arc into useless shading. Divers who examined the arc found fragments of synthetic netting, iron skids, and the occasional rubber fender, the detritus of structures designed to stay submerged and unseen. The official explanation names coastal defense tests and derelict fishing gear, but fishermen tell of nights when small boats slipped through gaps in the nets while larger trawlers were guided elsewhere by manipulated channel lights. Speculative, this screen may have been an instrument of selective geography, allowing preferred traffic safe passage while obstructing others, a maritime equivalent of a checkpoint that never existed on paper. A retired netmender kept, almost reverently, a small leather thimble used for knotting heavy braid. It was ordinary and domestic and also an artifact of deliberate concealment. When the sea is skeined with nets that later fade into shading, which vessels do maps choose to remember? A hilltop triangulation plate included a minute square marked socket in an otherwise wide field of contouring. The drafter had underlined it with a single pen stroke. When an amateur surveyor returned to the site, he found a concrete collar with bolt holes the size and distribution of which suggested the former presence of a mounted instrument of some weight and precision. The bureaucratic explanation, an old benchmark mount, is tidy. Speculative notes from veteran technicians speak of rotating gear, of direction-finding arrays, of instruments that required secure bolting and in-the-field calibration. A retired technician whose hands still trembled from years of holding delicate optics kept a small, corroded bolt he had pried free and kept as a reminder of the heavy gear that once came and went. Physical evidence like a bolt insists on a material story the map only hints at in faint pen. If a socket once held an apparatus that pointed and listened, whose horizon was it trained on? On a marsh chart, an isolated little circle had been annotated. Cache? In a hesitant hand. The earth where the circle sat, when excavated, revealed a shallow pit lined with wooden planks and filled with wrapped bales whose bindings had rotted away, leaving only rusted nails and a faint smear of tar. The pedestrian reading, stowage for local farm stores, fails to account for the uniform wrapping and the care of water-shedding material used in the bindings. Local testimony recalls men arriving at night to collect a bale and leaving tokens of payment folded into the seams. Speculative inference imagines networks of barter and covert provisioning that used landscape rather than ledgers to broker exchanges inconvenient to the public record. A woman who kept the memory of a father's nod toward the marsh handed over a small coin she said had been given in payment once. It bore no state stamp and looked like a private currency for private transactions. When paper hesitates and asks a question mark at a circle, whose economy is being paused from view. A transport atlas held a faint annotation, a tiny rectangle on a peninsula with the terse label. Rework. Fieldwork later uncovered reinforced slabs and a pattern of drainage channels that did not match local building practice but did match the footprints required by a heavy, temporary workshop. The institutional gloss calls it a reconfiguration of coastal yards for seasonal industry. Veterans recall a more secretive use. Nighttime conversion to fabrication sites where components were assembled away from prying inspection and then shipped under vague manifests. A retired fitter showed a small remains of a rivet with unusual dimensions and told a story of crates arriving without paperwork, things that, once assembled, left the peninsula by routes that later maps prefer not to emphasize. Objects like a peculiar rivet read as evidence of hands shaping metal for unknown purposes. If a work site is merely reworked on paper, who determines what counts as legitimate craft and who counts as a maker of hidden things? A railway clearance chart featured a short spur marked blind and a later, faint pencil scrawl. Use at night. When demolition finally opened the spur, crews found a compact shelter with shelves holding weather-stained papers and a ledger whose entries were names, times, and single-letter notations. The public account frames the spur as redundant infrastructure. The ledger's shadow speaks of coordination and repeated practice, a small logistical niche where the work of movement was choreographed in partial light. A retired guard whose voice still carried the cadence of rounds tapped an old watch on the table and said, "We had a rhythm for that place." Human rhythms, recorded in ruled columns, often keep steadier truths than annotated plates. When a siding is called blind, yet noted, use at night, who are the passengers meant to be unseen? A coastal defense overlay bore on it a curious series of arcs labeled with the shorthand, smoke array. The modern reconstruction of the site found not only canisters and pipework consistent with smoke generation but also a pattern of temporary platforms aligned to shorelines that, when occupied, would direct certain sightlines from the sea. Naval logs note experiments in camouflage and concealment. Fishermen remember nights when fog and engineered smoke combined to render stretches of coast unnavigable except by those who had been shown the safe cut. Speculative. Such arrays might have been part deception, part navigational partitioning. Atmospheric engineering used to shape maritime perception as much as environment. A former range hand kept a dented canister cap he had found in the dunes and would not sell it. The small, hollow disc was a material echo of manufactured opacity. If we can fabricate the fog that ships must see through, who decides which courses are permitted and which will be denied? A plateau survey sheet had a small star with the marginal note, "Instrument drop." When investigators visited the location, they found a depression with a neatly fitted metal box, its lid long corroded, containing fragments of copper and glass that suggested a portable instrument had once been stowed there for periodic retrieval. The tidy explanation, an accidental loss cached for recovery, sits beside a more purposeful reading, a field drop point used to seed or exchange sensor packages without a permanent base. A retired courier, hands scarred and steady, produced a folded instruction leaflet, edges browned, ink faded, that read like a scavenger hunt for men at night. It was practical, bureaucratic, and conspiratorial all at once. If an instrument is meant to be dropped and later collected, what network of hands and trusts binds the paper to the earth? A wooded training map showed a ring of small, evenly spaced dots annotated only as demonstration. When archaeologists brushed the soil between the dots, they found traces of man-made resin, embedded plates, and the discolored ground where heat had been applied repeatedly. The military manual account offers demonstrations as instructional activities. Local recollection remembers sets of men in protective gear manipulating devices while young conscripts watched from a distance. Speculative threads wonder whether the demonstrations were not mere teaching but staged performances to normalize a new technology for observers, to let them see and accept rather than to make them complicit. A veteran of the demonstrations pressed into the author's hand a small blistered glove and said, with a flat voice, "You learn to do by seeing someone else do." Objects like a glove thus become teaching relics, intimate evidence of a pedagogy that socialized technological practice. When demonstration becomes ritual, who is being taught to accept and who is being taught to obey? As the final reels of our investigation unwind, one last image remains, a composite overlay where all these ghost symbols, dots, crosses, strange abbreviations, and erased lines, align almost perfectly along what seems like a wandering vein of geography. It threads through mountains, under fields, across coastlines. The alignment is too consistent to be accident, too faint to be certainty. Historians who've studied the correlation caution that pattern seeking is a human reflex. But mapmakers, too, are human, prone to leave messages to one another in codes more emotional than technical. Maybe the alignment isn't a secret corridor or forgotten front, but a trail of human intention, the residue of people who worked under oaths of silence and still wanted, in some small way, to be remembered. There's an odd beauty in that idea. A map, after all, is not the land, it's a confession of how someone once tried to understand the land. Every contour and symbol, every erased mark, tells us what its author feared or loved enough to hide. The ghost marks on old military maps whisper of minds wrestling with uncertainty, with the tension between revealing and concealing, between defense and discovery. What we inherit now are their silences rendered in ink. If one walks those landscapes today, through hollow dunes, abandoned depots, or sunken valleys, the physical traces have nearly all dissolved. Yet on certain days, when light hits the ground at a slant, patterns appear briefly, soil discolorations, faint ridges, or a line of stones pointing nowhere. They mimic the secret symbols once drawn by unseen hands. Whether that's coincidence or the Earth's own memory replaying human design is impossible to say. What remains is the unease, the sense that maps may have been not guides, but mirrors, reflecting the unknown as much as the known. And so the question lingers, echoing through the folds of parchment and the layers of soil alike. Were these cryptic discoveries the echoes of forgotten experiments, or the mapmaker's final attempt to record mysteries even they could not explain?